Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and inspiring tales of resilience, betrayal, and triumph. Today, we bring you the story of Madison, a woman whose world was turned upside down by those she trusted most. After losing her hearing in her teens, Madison built a life of success and independence. But when the silence lifted, so did the layers of deception that had been hidden from her for years. Join us as we follow her journey of discovering the truth, reclaiming her life, and proving that no one can silence her. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's tale. Hello, dear listener. Let me tell you a story that might sound familiar to some, but perhaps not in the way you'd expect. This is a story about Madison, a woman who had learned to navigate life without one of her senses. A woman whose silence was both a companion and a prison. Madison's story didn't start in a way most of us might imagine. Her world, from a very young age, had been filled with sound, laughter, music, the hum of life moving around her. She could hear the songs of birds at dawn, the laughter of friends, and the whispers of loved ones. But that changed suddenly, when she was a teenager. One day, without any explanation, Madison lost her hearing. It was as if her entire world had been swallowed by silence. The doctors couldn't explain why or how it happened. It was a mystery, and yet, it was her reality. At first, the silence was unbearable. It crushed her spirit and left her isolated. The world around her continued without pause, while she struggled to adapt. In her moments of despair, she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of muffled voices. Friends who once laughed with her seemed distant. Her family's conversations, once comforting, were now nothing more than gestures and lip reading. She learned to read lips, to understand their language, but it was never the same. She had to fight hard, to rebuild a life in a world that no longer spoke her language. But Madison was resilient. She always had been. Over time, she found strength in the silence, learned to live with it, and even excelled. She became skilled in sign language, a language that spoke to her more deeply than anything she had known before. She earned a degree, built a successful business, and created a life for herself that many admired. But despite her success, there was always a part of her that longed for what was lost, the simple sound of music, the rich laughter of her friends, the comforting hum of life. In the quietest moments, she felt that yearning deep inside her soul. And then, there was Ethan. Ethan had been by her side for 6 years. He had been her rock. Through every trial, every silent night, he stood with her. When she struggled to hear, he patiently spoke to her. Even if his words were swallowed by the silence, he learned to communicate with her in ways that didn't require sound. His presence was always reassuring. He made sure she never felt less than. Despite her disability, he told her that her deafness didn't define her, that she was as beautiful, as capable, as anyone who could hear. He was her support, her confidant, and her lover. But lately, things had begun to feel different. Madison didn't know exactly when it started, but she began to notice it in the little things. The way Ethan's touch, once warm and comforting, now felt distant, almost obligatory. His gaze, which used to be full of love and affection, was often unreadable, distant. At first, she brushed it off. She attributed it to the stress of work, the pressure they were both under. Surely, it was nothing more than fatigue. But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. Even with the discomfort she felt in their marriage, Madison had no reason to doubt Ethan. He had always been there for her, hadn't he? They had built a life together, one that was full of love and respect. But as the days passed, the small cracks in their relationship grew larger. Madison started to feel like an outsider in her own home, in her own life. The social gatherings that used to bring her joy now drained her. Conversations became exhausting. Every word required concentration, every smile an effort. And yet, she had always found solace in Ethan. He was the one person who made her feel like she truly belonged, even in a world that didn't fully understand her. Then, there was hope on the horizon. The possibility of hearing again. Madison had been told for years that she could never regain her hearing. But a new surgery offered a chance. A chance to step out of the silence that had defined so much of her life. She felt a flutter of excitement, of hope that perhaps just perhaps, she would once again hear the world around her. Music, laughter, voices, it was all within reach. She would finally experience the sounds she had missed for so long. This was her chance to step into a new world, one where silence would no longer be her only companion. But what Madison didn't know was that the sounds waiting for her would shatter her world in ways she never could have imagined. The day of the surgery came faster than she had expected. Sitting in the cold hospital room, her nerves tingled with anticipation. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. For so many years, she glanced at Ethan, who sat beside her, his expression unreadable. He squeezed her hand lightly, but there was something forced in his demeanor. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're going to do great," he said, but his voice seemed hollow. Madison nodded, choosing to believe in him, choosing to trust that everything would be okay. Little did she know, the person she trusted the most had already begun to betray her. Madison woke up hours later. The sterile smell of the hospital room surrounding her. The quiet beeping of machines providing a steady rhythm in the background. Her head felt heavy, her thoughts foggy, and yet there was an undeniable feeling of excitement pulsing within her. The surgery had been a success. The doctors assured her. Slowly, as the anesthesia wore off, she became aware of the subtle sounds around her. The beeping of the machines. The soft rustling of someone moving. The muffled voices of nurses in the hallway. Her heart raced, and she blinked rapidly, trying to process what she was hearing. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A faint, unrecognizable noise. A small glimpse into a world she had once known. She struggled to sit up, her body heavy from the effects of the procedure. As she glanced around, her eyes found Ethan, who was standing by her side. His face was still unreadable, but his gaze met hers. And she saw something, a flicker of something she couldn't name, before he quickly masked it with a smile. "You're doing great," he said again, his voice flat, but Madison didn't think much of it. She was too caught up in the overwhelming rush of hearing something again. Even if it was distorted and faint, the world was coming back to life around her, piece by piece. Over the next few days, the sounds gradually became clearer. The beeping was now joined by the rustling of leaves outside the hospital window. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner of the room. The faint murmur of conversations that she hadn't been able to hear in years. At times, the sounds overwhelmed her, too much to process. Her brain struggled to keep up with the flood of noise. But Madison was determined to embrace it. She marveled at every new sound, every new sensation that had once been lost to her. But even as she embraced the new world she was discovering, there was something nagging at her, something she couldn't quite place. Ethan's behavior seemed to grow more distant by the day. He was always on his phone, stepping away to take calls, often disappearing for long stretches of time. When he was home, his words seemed carefully measured, almost like he was choosing them with caution. The touch that once felt warm and full of love now seemed mechanical, as if he was going through the motions. Madison tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just the stress of the situation. After all, she had just undergone a major surgery. But a feeling of unease began to settle deep within her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that something wasn't right. One evening, as Madison sat by the window, savoring the sounds of the city outside, she heard Ethan talking in the other room. His voice was low and urgent, but she could hear it clearly now. Curiosity piqued. She quietly moved toward the door, her heart racing as she listened in. It was the first time in years that she didn't have to rely on lip reading or intuition to understand what was happening. "I told you we have to be careful," Ethan's voice whispered. Madison's breath caught in her throat. She paused, listening harder. "She doesn't suspect anything yet," he continued. Then, she heard it, a woman's giggle, soft but unmistakable. Madison's mind went blank for a moment as she clutched the doorframe. Trying to steady herself, her heart pounded in her chest as she listened to the rest of the conversation. Though she couldn't fully comprehend what was being said, Ethan's voice became firmer. "Just be patient. We'll figure this out." The conversation ended abruptly, and silence followed. Madison stepped back, her hands trembling. She didn't need to hear more. She didn't need to understand the full details of the conversation. She knew, She knew the betrayal that had been happening behind her back. Her body went cold, the rush of emotions overwhelming her. The man she had trusted with everything, the man who had stood by her, the one person she believed would never deceive her, had been lying to her all along. And the worst part? She had no idea how deep the betrayal ran. Was this the beginning? Or had it been happening for a while? Had Ethan and her sister, Olivia, been conspiring against her for months? The questions flooded her mind, each one more painful than the last. For the first time in years, Madison felt a sense of loss so profound it shook her to the core. She had spent so much time in silence, trusting that Ethan was her protector, her anchor, but now, with her hearing restored, the silence had lifted, and the truth had come crashing into her world. The world she had fought so hard to rebuild was unraveling before her eyes. The foundation she had built her life on was nothing more than a lie. As she backed away from the door, her body trembling, she knew that everything had changed. She was no longer the woman who had lived in silence, oblivious to the world around her. She had heard the truth. And now, nothing would ever be the same. Madison couldn't sleep that night. As much as she tried to close her eyes and escape the reality that had just shattered her world, sleep wouldn't come. The echo of Ethan's voice, the faint sound of Olivia's giggle, played on a loop in her mind. Every word, every whisper felt like a cruel melody, one that she couldn't silence no matter how hard she tried. Lying in bed, her thoughts raced. How long had this been going on? Had Ethan been lying to her for months? Years? Had Olivia, the sister she had trusted with her life, been the one to betray her? The questions swirled, each one more painful than the last. But the answers remained elusive. Madison couldn't make sense of any of it. She had spent so many years in silence, waiting for the day she could finally hear the world again. And now, with her hearing restored, all she could hear was the painful truth of her betrayal. The next few days felt like a blur. She moved through her house, pretending everything was fine. On the surface, she smiled, spoke, and acted like the woman she had always been. But inside, her world was unraveling. Every interaction with Ethan felt like an act, a performance she didn't know how to stop. She watched him more closely now, noticing the way he looked at his phone more often, the way he hurried out of the room whenever she entered. She could feel his distance growing with each passing day. But Madison wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. She needed to be sure, to have evidence, to know the full extent of the betrayal before she made her move. So, she kept watching, listening, waiting. Her hearing had become both a gift and a weapon, and she was determined to use it wisely. Then, one afternoon, she caught a glimpse of Ethan's laptop sitting open on the desk. It was a rare sight. He was always so careful with his things. Madison felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't resist the temptation to look. Moving quietly, she approached the desk and glanced at the screen. The laptop was unlocked, and the message thread that appeared in front of her was enough to make her stomach turn. The words were clear, unmistakable. "I miss you." Her pulse quickened as she read on. Olivia's response followed, "Soon. My love, just be patient." Madison's fingers went numb as she read the messages. She didn't need to read the entire exchange to understand what was happening. The evidence was right there, in front of her, proof that the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with everything, had been lying to her. Worse still, her own sister, the woman she had always considered her confidant, had been a part of it. Tears welled up in Madison's eyes as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Ethan and Olivia hadn't just betrayed her, they had been conspiring against her, using her deafness as a shield to hide their affair. Every family gathering, every conversation with Olivia, every moment she had shared with her sister now felt like a lie. The memories that had once been comforting now burned with the sting of betrayal. Her body trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. But she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let them see her break. Not yet. Not until she had everything she needed. She stepped away from the laptop, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind was a whirlwind. But one thought kept repeating itself. She couldn't confront them yet. She had to wait. The time would come. But it wasn't now. For the next few days, Madison played the part of the oblivious wife and sister. She smiled at Ethan, asked about his day, even suggested they take a trip together once she had fully adjusted to her hearing. He seemed relieved by her apparent ignorance. But Madison could see the tension in his eyes. He thought he was getting away with it. He thought she hadn't figured it out. But she was far from blind. She was watching, listening, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment would come. Madison promised herself. She would make them pay for the way they had used her, manipulated her, and betrayed her trust. She wasn't the same woman she had been before the surgery, before the silence was lifted. She had regained more than just her hearing. She had regained her strength, her voice, and soon, she would make Ethan and Olivia realize just how wrong they were to think they could get away with their betrayal. The days that followed were filled with tension. But Madison had learned the art of patience over the years. She had always been resilient. But now, in the face of betrayal, her silence became a strategy. Her calm demeanor a weapon. She had spent too much time in the shadows of others to let this moment pass by recklessly. At first, she focused on her work. The company that she had spent years building was still hers. Even if Ethan had tried to manipulate it. Even if he had been playing his own games behind the scenes. She refused to let him take that from her. She began shifting the dynamics in the office. Making subtle changes to the company's operations. Ensuring that everything was running smoothly. But her mind, despite her focus, kept drifting back to the evidence she had uncovered. Madison's emotions were a whirlwind inside her. On the outside, she appeared to be her usual composed self. But inside, the weight of betrayal pressed heavily on her chest. Every time Ethan glanced at her with that forced smile. Every time Olivia called, pretending to still be her sister. Madison could feel the deceit hanging in the air. It was unbearable. But she would not confront them yet. She needed more. It wasn't long before an opportunity presented itself. Madison had been observing Ethan's behavior carefully. He had become more careless. More arrogant. He thought she hadn't noticed the late-night meetings. The frequent trips that always seemed to coincide with Olivia's schedule. Madison could feel the walls closing in on him. But she knew it wasn't enough yet. She needed something solid. Something undeniable. One evening, while Ethan was taking a shower, he left his phone on the kitchen counter. Madison's heart pounded as she saw the phone vibrate. A message lighting up the screen. She couldn't resist. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. But she didn't hesitate. The messages were there, as she had expected. And they confirmed everything. The love notes. The promises of a future together. The cruel jokes about how easy it had been to deceive her. It was all laid out before her. The betrayal was deeper than she had ever imagined. They had been plotting against her for months. Maybe even longer. And it wasn't just about an affair. It was about destroying everything she had worked for, her company, her life, and her sense of self. Madison swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She couldn't let her emotions get the better of her. She had been patient for too long. This was her moment. But she wasn't ready to confront them just yet. No, she had to be smarter. She had to make them believe they were still in control. So, she placed the phone back exactly as she had found it, careful not to disturb anything. A slow, deliberate smile spread across her face. They thought they were outsmarting her. They thought her silence was ignorance. But they had underestimated her. She wasn't the woman they had thought her to be. For the next few days, Madison kept up the act. She greeted Ethan with a warm smile, pretending to be oblivious to everything that had transpired. She listened to his excuses, nodded along with his stories, and even played the role of the trusting wife. But all the while, she was calculating her next move. She began laying the groundwork for their downfall, dropping small hints to her colleagues about Ethan's shady dealings. She reached out to a few trusted contacts within the company, feeding them information bit by bit. She knew that the moment for her final strike would come soon. And when it did, Ethan and Olivia would be blindsided. Every interaction, every moment with Ethan and Olivia now felt like a performance to Madison. They had played her for a fool. But now, she was playing the game on her terms. She would make them regret every moment of deception. The storm was coming, and Madison would be the one to bring it. It was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. She just had to wait for the perfect moment to expose them. And when she did, they would learn that Madison was not someone to be underestimated. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than Madison had anticipated. All her careful planning, every small detail she had put into motion, was about to come to fruition. As she sat in the conference room, surrounded by key stakeholders, she could feel the weight of what was about to happen. She had gathered everything, irrefutable evidence, recordings, emails, and messages, all neatly packaged, ready to expose the lies that had been haunting her for months. When the time came, Madison didn't hesitate. She orchestrated the perfect moment, ensuring that every word of betrayal would be heard by the very people who had once believed in Ethan and Olivia. As the incriminating recordings played for the board, Madison remained calm, watching as their world crumbled in front of them. Ethan's face drained of color, his arrogance replaced with fear. Olivia, once so confident, was now a shell of the woman she used to be, her eyes pleading for Madison's forgiveness. But it was too late. Madison stood tall, the weight of their deception finally lifting off her shoulders. She had fought for her truth, and now it was hers. Ethan and Olivia were exposed, their careers in ruins, their futures uncertain. For Madison, this moment wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming herself, her power, and her peace. She had been through so much, and now, she was free. As she walked away from the wreckage they had created, Madison knew that the journey ahead would be hers to shape. No one would silence her again. The future was bright, and this was just the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more videos like this one, where we dive into the lessons life has to offer. Thank you for watching, and remember to share this with someone who needs to hear it.